Hello, this is Gershon Wolf, and welcome to Modern Music Composition. Well, today we're going to be composing a piece of music using techniques from atonal music composition. But before we dive into the particular techniques that we're going to be using today, let's just briefly review what is meant by tonal music, atonal music, and then what is in the middle, quasi-tonal music, which shares properties from both tonality and atonality. Well, let's start with tonal music. Tonal music is essentially the use of major and minor tonality, meaning that there's an established central chord called the tonic. For example, if you're in C major, C is referred to as the tonic. And then there are triads formed for every note that is in that particular diatonic scale. So for example, in C, it's known as the 1 chord. Its triad would be C, E, G. There are other important chords, in particular major chords, the 4 and the 5. And once again in C major, that would be F and G, F being 4 and G being the 5th. So in tonality, the harmonic functions are based on the 1 and the 5. So in our example, it would be C and G. And usually tension is created by moving from consonants, meaning pleasant sounding music, stable music, to unstable music, dissonance. Dissonance usually implies some kind of tension, and it's usually in reference to the tonic. So you're creating some type of note or chord that is, it's in disagreement to the way the tonic is usually wanting to sound. And then that dissonance is resolved through some kind of progression back to consonants. And normally the way that that's done, that resolution, is done through methods using counterpoint and all the different species of counterpoint, which I've covered in previous videos, so we're certainly not going to touch on that today. So now let's move over to atonal music. Well, atonal music is a completely different beast. Remember, for a piece to be tonal, it has to have this harmonic function, the dominant, which is the 5th, the subdominant, the 4th, and the tonic, which is the 1 chord. And it has some type of voice leading, from this dissonance to this consonance using these techniques in counterpoint. Well, atonal music, none of that applies. And in fact, atonal music is taking all 12 tones of the chromatic scale and not weighting one tone over the other. They're all pretty much equal. So in other words, the triadic structures in atonal music don't really apply in the same manner as they do in tonal music. And in fact, in atonal music, you have what are called non-triadic harmonic function, whereas in tonal music, it's called harmonic function. And it's interesting because these non-triadic harmonic functions actually function as reference elements in atonal music. And that starts to move us a little bit into quasi-tonality. You start to feel a little bit of a centricity with respect to the way the music's flowing. So it's not completely random. Okay? So we're going to be also discussing today the 12-tone technique briefly, and how it is actually used, elements of it are used to compose this piece of music that we're going to put together today. So the technique that we're actually going to be using here is called complementary cycles of inversion. Well, that's going to be all explained to you today if it sounds foreign right now. So we're going to be composing with these cycles of inversion using the properties that we learned from this 12-tone techniques. And within the 12-tone technique, what you do is you create what's called a tone row. And that tone row starts with a reference sequence. That reference sequence is called a prime sequence. Then you perform operations on this prime sequence. You invert it. You can take the retrograde, which is the reverse of the prime, or you can take the retrograde inversion, which is just the reverse of the inversion. So these cycles have a more formal name. They're called inversionally complementary cycles. So let's talk about that for just a moment. Here are some notes about these complementary cycles. Here's a pretty tough statement, and I'm going to read it. The pitch class relations between any pair of inversionally related sets, and what I mean by inversionally related sets are these particular sets here, like P5 and I4, and we'll explain what that means in the next couple of slides, that these sets are reducible to the pitch class relations. What's a pitch class relation? Well, it turns out, here's your pitch class relation. It's called an add 9. Every single one of these tones with respect to each set add up to 9. So these pitch class relations between two inversionally related representations of the semitone scale. Each one of these is an inversionally related semitone scale. In other words, P5 is related to I4 in some way. You may actually be able to see that just by visualizing in this particular sequence. By the way, these numbers correspond to the 12 tones of the chromatic scale, where 0 is a C. So a 1 would be the 0 is a C. The 1 would be a C sharp or a D flat, and then it just proceeds. 2 is a D, and onward. But what you want to note here is that I've taken these two sets, which actually comes out of creating what's called the 12-tone matrix, which we'll go through today, and noting the fact that as I line these up, they all add up to a 9. Now remember, if you take this particular set here, the 11 and the 10, remember that we're working in mod 12 because the chromatic scale has 12 tones. So mod 12 of 21 is 9, right? Because I take 21 and I subtract 12 from it. So these interval rows have a particular name associated with it. This pair of sets, it's called a PI dyad, for prime and inversion. And we'll refer to these as PI dyads. And Arnold Schoenberg, which is essentially the father of the 12-tone technique, and certainly the father, or one of the fathers of atonal music, used this particular technique of these cycle sets, these PI dyads, throughout a lot of his pieces. And for example, I just mentioned one here, the Variations for Piano, Opus 27. So first thing we want to do, and we're going to step through this in a very methodical way, is we're going to create a 12-tone matrix. They're very easy to create. Essentially, you choose some reference tone row and call that P0. Then from that one row, we can generate the entire matrix. All we need to know is that single P0 row. Over here to the right, I've got here a clock diagram. And below it, I've got the circle of fifth diagram. Let's not get these two confused, because the upper diagram is essentially just stepping through the chromatic scale, where 0 is C, 1 is C sharp, 2 is D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp at 6 o'clock, and onward back to C. So I've created this particular tone row with a little bit of thought behind it. Every step from 0 to 7 is a perfect fifth. 7 to 2 is a perfect fifth, because if I start at 7 and I work my way around this clock to 2, I'm sorry, if I start at 7, I work my way around this clock, I go 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2. I end up at 2. Sorry, that's right, 2. That's 7 semitones. That's a perfect fifth. So what I've done here is I've just sort of walked through perfect fifths. 0, 7, 2, 9, 4, 11. You can work your way around that clock many times before you end up with 12 tones of the perfect fifth. So why did I show the circle of fifths diagram, because we're just basically walking through C, G, D, A, E, B, F sharp, or if you want to call it G flat, D flat, A flat, E flat, B flat, F. And that's what we've done here in terms of creating this prime sequence. So once again, just to define these particular four transformations, prime is the original set, retrograde is the reverse of that, inversion is just the inversion of pitch, and once again the retrograde inversion is just the reverse of the inversion. So that's actually an I, that's not a 1, so that's I naught, I0. How did I create I0? Well, if you look at the clock diagram, back over here at the clock diagram, it's really easy. All I need to do is take each number and basically create a plane down from 0 to 6 as a mirror, and then just mirror over to one side or the other, and I've got that inversion. Let's go through this example. Let's say P naught, I've got 7. Well, what's the inversion of 7? I'm at 7. Well, that's easy. It's 5. What's the inversion of 2? 2, I go back over this way, it's 10. So I just march my way over here, and I've calculated I naught, the first inversion. Well, what does this 12-tone matrix look like? Well, this is exactly what it looks like. I've gone through and I've calculated all my primes, and then from each one of those I can calculate all my inversions, and then I can calculate all my retrogrades on the right-hand side, and then likewise, if I've already calculated my inversion, by default I've calculated my retrograde inversion. A couple interesting things to note here. First, the prime and the retrograde inversion are extremely similar. In fact, they have the same intervals, just in reverse order. So that's just upside down and backwards. What does that mean? Well, let's talk about P naught as an example. I start off at 0, I go 7 to 9. If I take the retrograde inversion right down here at the bottom, you see that I've got that same sequence going back up, 7, 2, 9, 4. So by default, those intervals are going to be in the same order. By the way, speaking of intervals, no matter what interval that you create in this matrix for your prime or your inverse, all the intervals are preserved. No new intervals are created, and no intervals are destroyed. So what's interesting to note in tonal music is that chords belong to the same scale. In atonal music, you can perform all kinds of operations on chords that you define. So there's a lot more variation to it. Okay, so let's talk about going from the 12-tone matrix, creating these 48 different transformations, and then using that to compose our piece of music. Okay, so what is the strategy we're going to take to compose this piece of music? Well, it turns out from that 12-tone matrix, you can actually create both melodies and harmonies, and it's really interesting to learn techniques in what's called serialism. You can go even further. In today's video, we're not going to touch necessarily on any real serious aspects of serialism, other than to say that essentially serialism takes a tonal row and performs even more operations on that particular row. But suffice it to say that with this technique, there are only about 479 million permutations of the semitone scale. How is that number achieved? That's just taking 12 factorial, because there are 12 semitones. Turns out actually a lot of those permutations are the same. In reality, there's about 10 million unique permutations of the semitone scale. Certainly enough material to last you a lifetime, a couple lifetimes. So let's proceed. So what's the first step in composing our piece of music? Well, we're going to be using this technique using these two rows, these pi dyads, what are called pi dyads, one prime row, one inverse row. And we're going to be sticking with some 9 rows. In other words, rows when they're lined up, each vertical set of numbers adds up to 9. And in our case, that's achieved actually by horizontally using intervals, perfect fifths, which is 7 semitones. So we call that interval 7. There's actually quite a few of the pi dyad sum 9s in that matrix. You could use, here, let me change my color here. You could use P5I4, P6 I3, P7 I2, P8 I1, P9 I0, etc. We're going to concentrate actually on P8 I1 for our pi dyad sum 9. So here it is in all its glory. We've got our 8th transposition of our prime sequence, and we've got its relationship to the first inverse. So these sets alternate in a way that unfold these complementary cycles, and they unfold in a way that creates only a single interval. That's the important aspect here, the single interval, and that's known as a cyclic set. So these two represent a cyclic set, because as was shown earlier, as you you can add each one of these up to 9. Remember mod 12, and you can just march across and prove that to yourself. So in these cyclic sets, there's 2 pitch classes that are immediate neighbors of any one of these elements. So for example, if I take 5, I've got neighbors of 10 and 0. If I'm in taking reference of 0 to C, 5 would be F, and 10 would be A sharp or B flat. So taking any neighbors of these elements of the P8 set, for example, always forms the same interval, a perfect fifth. And you can once again prove to yourself, marching across here, that we've done that. So let's use those simple properties to compose just a very small piece of music. Well, there you have it. There's our piece of music. What have we done to create this piece of music using this pi dyad, in particular this prime 8 inverse 1 dyad? Well, we've taken properties of its add 9. So as we march across here, each one of these notes in linear fashion represent starting from 8, which is G sharp, or how should I put it, A flat. Here's our A flat. And then we've gone down to 1, which is C sharp or D flat. And then we've started again at 3 and gone down to 6. 3 is D sharp or E flat. Here we are. Down to 6, which is F sharp or G flat. And we've just done that across this entire dyad set, and that's how we've generated this one single piece of music. And believe it or not, that shows up in a lot of atonal compositions using these cyclic properties. So here's how it's spelled out right down here, all 24 tones. Let's move on to a little bit more interesting aspect of this. So we've got our piece of music now. Well, and that sounds a particular way, but now let's start to add a little bit of structure to it. Let's add some kind of rhythm to this piece of music, and that takes it a little bit step towards some type of centricity. What I mean is just adding a particular rhythm, if that rhythm is repeated, adds centricity. In other words, adds some type of central quasi-tonal nature to the piece of music. So here's our newly created row right here using a particular rhythm. So you can see that essentially these two measures here and here are very similar to one another. And so just by doing that, you've added some type of centricity to the music, some type of reference now to what is just a bunch of random notes. I don't want to say that they're random notes, but they're notes without any key. So these rhythmic structures are very important in atonal music, and they're certainly very important in tonal music, but in atonal music they provide a crucial role in terms of creating some type of centric behavior to the music. So onward and upward, let's now do something a little bit more sophisticated than just creating a single row melody. Let's now subdivide the original row that we had in our dyad that we had created, the original row that we'd created from the dyad, the 24 notes, into overlapping 3-note segments. So now we're creating some harmony in our atonal piece of music. And so that's pretty cool. So how is that actually accomplished? Well, you can see from the bottom row is essentially just that continuation, well, not continuation, it is essentially just taking 8, 1, 3, 6, 10, 11, and marching across. That was our melody essentially. Well, what is creating our harmony? Well, let's go through an example here. Let's take the second element, and that would correspond to our 1 here, which corresponds to this note here, which is D flat, and here we are at 1, D flat. So how have we created this harmonic structure? How have we achieved this A flat and above it the E flat? Well, if you look at, let me just do this in different colors so that we can, here's A flat, here is E flat, and A flat's right there, and E flat is right there, because we can see that 8 and 3 correspond to A flat and E flat. And once again, we march across and create our harmonic structure by just marching across our PI dyad to create this particular piece of music. And believe it or not, if you play this music, which I'll provide all the MP3s for all these pieces of music, it actually sounds pretty cool. So in summary, you've got just the bass row is just the sequence of notes from the melody, and the upper row is created by taking the neighbor notes of that particular melody. Now remember, our interval was interval 7, meaning a perfect fifth. That was chosen for a particular reason. Once again, let's add some rhythm to this particular harmonic piece of music. Now I can call it harmonic because we've got some chords here. So I've added a similar harmonic structure to this piece of music as we did in our basic melody. And once again, when you play this piece of music, it sounds actually quite satisfying and sounds quite different, obviously, from just the original row of music that we created that are just all of the same note duration. So, in a nutshell, the atonal music composition, especially music that has basic elements derived from this 12-tone matrix, can be a very nice starting point for creating some really cool pieces of music. And I mentioned voice leading here because that's actually what we're doing here. We're creating our own version of voice leading. In future videos that I produce, we're going to get into the topic of centricity. I've mentioned it a couple times, but it's quite a large field in atonal music and involves quite a bit of methodology. We can use diatonic scale, octatonic, whole tone scale, what are called derived sets, and then once again use those with complementary cycles to create all kinds of cool pieces of music. But that's not for this video. I just mention it now just because that's coming onto the horizon here. So it's just important to note that much lengthier pieces of music can be composed with just starting from these simple seeds of these prime rows, these simple fundamental elements of these cyclic sets. So actually, let's keep going with our example here of our P8I1 dyad example. So let's go and create a much larger piece of music. Now what we're going to do is take this example, expand it to include a more complex harmony, more complex rhythm, and we're going to be shifting the melody around in some unique and creative ways. With respect to the harmony, what are we going to do? Well, the simple stacks that you saw in that previous piece of music, what we're going to do is add an additional note on top of that, those two notes to create triads. The note that is actually added is going to fill that perfect fifth with a major third. So what have we done? We've actually created, so for example in C, for an example, if the perfect fifth went from C to G, we'd be filling it with an E, which is the major third. So what are we doing here? We're adding, I don't want to call it tonality, but we're adding reference to the piece of music that is going to make you feel a little bit more at home. With respect to the rhythm, on this particular piece of music, we're going to introduce what's called the Quasi 3-2 rhythm. The 3-2 being the hemiola structure of rhythm, and that's going to be produced between the bass and the treble notes. And so that's going to convert actually treble notes. We're going to convert the treble notes into these triplets and arpeggiate the triplets, and they'll offset the bass notes. Well, what does this piece of music look like? It looks like this piece of music right here. This piece of music, it was completely derived from a P8I1 dyad set, and it's been modified with what I've just mentioned to you, with all these ideas of creating triads, arpeggiating through them, and adding a bass structure of rhythm to create this 3-2, this Quasi 3-2 hemiola type structure. And just to kind of show you what I mean by that, let's take a look at this. I actually purposely expanded measure 11 so that you could see what was going on here. In a hemiola, basically you've got a system of notes where these particular notes are lined up, and then you progress over here on top with these triplets, and on the bass notes they're offset, almost like a little syncopation. It's kind of cool. I've actually added some suspensions here, and that gives some structure to the piece of music. So once again, you'll be able to listen to the MP3 that I've created from this, and that's it. I will see you later. Bye-bye.